I found him on a rainy Tuesday night in a Seattle alley, collapsed against a dumpster, barely conscious. His clothes were torn and filthy, and when I knelt beside him and asked his name, he looked at me with storm-gray eyes and whispered, "I don't know." Everyone else had walked past him like he was invisible. I should have called 911 and left. But something in those eyes stopped me. Something that didn't match the dirt on his skin or the desperation in his voice. I made a choice that night that would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. About mercy, about the line between saving someone and falling for them. Because 6 weeks later, that homeless man showed up at my apartment door in a $10,000 suit and said 3 words that made my blood run cold. "Hello, Lily. I've been looking for you. Tell us which country you're watching from." I love knowing how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Lily Carter. I'm 29 years old, and I've been a nurse at Seattle General Hospital for 5 years, working night shifts in the emergency department. That Tuesday started like any other shift. 12 hours of trauma and scared families waiting for news that would either shatter them or save them. By 2 in the morning, my feet ached and all I wanted was to get home to my tiny studio apartment and sleep. I took my usual route, cutting through the alley behind 5th Avenue because it saved 5 minutes. The rain had started around midnight, that persistent Seattle drizzle, and by the time I turned into the alley, my jacket was damp and my hair was plastered to my face. That's when I saw him. A figure slumped against the dumpster halfway down the alley. So still that for a terrible moment I thought he might be dead. I should have kept walking. I should have called 911 from a safe distance and let someone else handle it. That's what my mother would have told me to do. What every safety training I'd ever had said to do. But I'm a nurse, and nurses don't walk past people who might be dying, even when every self-preservation instinct is screaming at us to run. I approached slowly, my phone already in my hand with 911 ready to dial if this went wrong. He was wearing clothes that might have been nice once, but were now torn and stained beyond recognition. Jeans and a button-down shirt that hung off his frame like he'd lost weight recently. His head was tilted back against the dumpster, eyes closed, rain running down his face and mixing with the dirt on his skin. I knelt beside him, my nursing training kicking in automatically as I reached for his wrist to check his pulse. His skin was cold and clammy, his pulse weak but steady, and when I gently touched his shoulder and said, "Sir, can you hear me?" his eyes opened. Storm-gray eyes that locked onto mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. His lips moved, and I had to lean closer to hear the whisper that escaped them. "I don't know. I don't know who I am." My mind raced through possibilities. Head injury, amnesia, drugs, alcohol, mental health crisis. All of them dangerous. All of them reasons to call for backup and let the professionals handle this. But then I noticed his hands. They were resting on his knees, and despite the dirt covering them, despite the torn clothes and the desperation in his voice, those hands were wrong. Too smooth, no calluses. Clean nails, or at least nails that had been clean recently. These weren't the hands of someone who'd been living on the streets for long. And when I looked closer at his face, past the dirt and the exhaustion, I saw bone structure that spoke of good genetics and probably good nutrition for most of his life. This man hadn't grown up on the streets. Something about this didn't add up. I made a decision that I would question 1,000 times over the next few weeks. "Sir, I'm a nurse. I'm going to help you. Can you stand if I help you?" He nodded slowly, and with my support, he managed to get to his feet. He was tall, at least 6'3", and even in his weakened state, I could feel the muscle beneath his clothes. This man had been strong once, probably still was under the exhaustion. I should have taken him to the hospital. But something stopped me, some instinct that said, if I took him to Seattle General without ID, without insurance, they'd stabilize him and send him right back to the streets. And something about those storm gray eyes made me think he was in danger, real danger, the kind that emergency rooms with their cameras and records might make worse. So I did something incredibly stupid and possibly illegal. I took him home. My apartment was 15 minutes away on foot, but it took us 30 because he could barely walk, leaning heavily on me with each step, his breath coming in ragged gasps that made me worry about broken ribs or internal injuries. We didn't pass anyone, thank God, because I'm not sure how I would have explained a half-conscious homeless man draped over my shoulder at 2:30 in the morning. My building is a fourth-floor walk-up in a neighborhood that's trying to be trendy but hasn't quite made it yet. The kind of place where nobody asks questions because everyone has something they'd rather keep private. Getting him up 4 flights of stairs was a nightmare, but we managed. And by the time I got my door unlocked and half carried him inside, we were both shaking from exertion. I laid him on my couch, the only piece of furniture in my studio besides my bed, and immediately went into nurse mode. I grabbed my first aid kit from under the bathroom sink, filled a bowl with warm water, and started assessing the damage. His shirt was torn in several places, and when I carefully unbuttoned it and peeled it away from his skin, I sucked in a breath. Bruises, deep purple and black, covered his ribs and abdomen. Someone had beaten him. Badly. Probably within the last 24 hours based on the color and swelling. I checked for broken ribs, running my fingers carefully over each one, and found at least 2 that were probably cracked. His breathing was shallow but steady, which meant his lungs were likely okay, but he needed rest and pain management. There was a cut on his forehead that had bled but was already clotting. Not deep enough for stitches, but deep enough to leave a scar. I cleaned it carefully, my hands steady from years of practice, even as my mind was racing with questions about who this man was and what had happened to him. He drifted in and out of consciousness while I worked, occasionally murmuring words that made no sense. Merger, board meeting, betrayal, trust. Words that suggested a life very different from sleeping in alleys. When I finished cleaning and bandaging the worst of his injuries, I covered him with my spare blanket and sat back on my heels, finally allowing myself to process what I'd just done. I had brought a strange man into my apartment. I hadn't called the police or the hospital. I had no idea who he was or what danger he might be in or represent. This was possibly the stupidest thing I'd ever done. But when I looked at his face, relaxed in unconsciousness, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. I spent that night in my bed, barely sleeping, checking on him every hour to make sure he was still breathing, that his condition wasn't deteriorating. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I never did, and spent the day monitoring my unexpected patient. He woke up periodically, confused and disoriented, asking the same question over and over. Where am I? Who am I? Who am I? I told him the truth. You're in my apartment in Seattle. I'm Lily. I'm a nurse. I found you in an alley. You were hurt. I brought you here to help you. Each time he would nod slowly, as if filing away the information, and then drift back to sleep. On the second day, I had to go back to work because I couldn't afford to lose my job, but I left him with water and crackers and a note explaining where I was. I worried about him all through my shift, half expecting to come home to find my apartment ransacked or him gone or worse. But when I walked through my door at 2:30 in the morning, he was exactly where I'd left him, awake this time, sitting up carefully and drinking water. Thank you, he said quietly, and his voice was different now, stronger, more focused. For helping me. I don't know why you did, but thank you. You needed help, I said simply, setting down my bag and crossing to check his bandages. That's reason enough. I don't even know your name, he said, and there was something in his voice that made me look up and meet those storm gray eyes. Lily Carter, I told him. And you? He was quiet for a long moment, and I saw frustration and fear flash across his face. I don't remember. I know that sounds crazy, but I woke up in that alley and everything before that is just gone. Head injury can cause temporary amnesia, I said, keeping my voice professional even as my heart ached for the confusion in his eyes. It might come back. What do you want me to call you? He thought for a moment. Alex, call me Alex. Okay, Alex, how are you feeling? Like I got hit by a truck. But better than yesterday. You're good at this. I'm a nurse, I said with a small smile. It's literally my job. He stayed for a week. I told myself it was because he wasn't strong enough to leave yet. Because his ribs needed time to heal and his memory needed time to return. But the truth was more complicated than that. I liked having him there. Alex was different from anyone I'd ever met. Even without his memories. Even wearing my old sweatpants because his clothes had been too damaged to salvage. There was something about him that commanded attention. He was intelligent. That much was obvious from the way he spoke. The vocabulary he used. The quick way he understood complex medical concepts when I explained his injuries. He was courteous, almost formally so, thanking me for every small kindness and insisting on trying to help around the apartment despite his injuries. And he was curious, asking me questions about my life, my work, my dreams, listening to my answers with a focus that made me feel like I was the most interesting person in the world. We fell into a strange domestic rhythm. I would come home from my shifts and find him reading books from my small collection or watching the news with a furrowed brow. As if trying to trigger some memory. I would make simple meals that we ate sitting on my couch, and he would tell me theories about who he might be based on the fragments that flickered through his mind. I think I wore suits, he said one night, staring at his hands. I keep having flashes of boardrooms and meetings and people hanging on my every word. Does that sound crazy? No, I said quietly. Your hands suggest you've never done manual labor. Your vocabulary suggests extensive education. You might have been a businessman. Might have been, he repeated, and there was something bitter in his voice. Past tense. Like that person is dead. You're not dead, I reminded him. You're right here. And whoever you were, that person is still in there. Is it wrong that I'm not sure I want him back? Alex looked at me, his gray eyes intense. What if the reason I ended up in that alley is because that person deserved it? What if I was a terrible human being? You're not terrible now, I said firmly. That's what matters. How do you know? You've known me for less than a week. Because terrible people don't thank someone for every glass of water. Because you tried to make my bed this morning even though moving hurts. Because you apologized to the spider you accidentally startled in the bathroom instead of killing it. Those aren't the actions of a terrible person. Maybe I'm just good at pretending. Then keep pretending. Fake it until you remember who you really are. He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his entire face, and I felt something shift in my chest. That night, we almost kissed. I was checking the bandage on his forehead, standing close enough to feel the heat of his body, and when I finished and stepped back, his hand caught my wrist gently. Lily, he said quietly, and the way he said my name made my breath catch. I looked down at him, at those storm gray eyes that seemed to see right through every defense I'd ever built, and I knew that if I didn't move right now, I was going to kiss this stranger who I'd found broken in an alley, whose real name I didn't even know. And the terrifying part was that I wanted to. But before I could make a decision, he released my wrist and leaned back, something like pain crossing his face. I'm sorry, he said. You've been so kind to me, and I have no right to complicate that with something that might be a mistake. It wouldn't be a mistake. I heard myself say, you know now that. You don't know me. How? I don't know me. And until I do, until I know who I am and what I'm running from, I can't ask you to take that risk. I stepped back, my professional mask sliding back into place even as my heart was racing. "You're probably right." "Probably," he agreed, but his eyes said something different. The next morning, he was gone. I came out of the bathroom after my shower to find the couch empty, the blanket neatly folded, and a note on my kitchen counter written in surprisingly elegant handwriting on the back of an old envelope. "Lily, thank you for saving my life. Thank you for seeing me as human when I had nothing to offer in return. You gave me something I didn't know I'd lost. I'm leaving because I remembered enough to know that staying puts you in danger, and I can't do that to you. You deserve better than to be caught up in whatever darkness I brought with me. Be safe, be happy." "You're extraordinary." I read the note 3 times, my hands shaking, before I finally let myself admit that my eyes were burning with unshed tears. I'd known him for 8 days. 8 days wasn't enough to fall for someone, wasn't enough to miss them like a physical ache when they were gone. But apparently, it was. I tried to move on. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts, staying busy so I wouldn't think about storm gray eyes and almost kisses and notes that said goodbye. I washed his blanket and put it back in my closet. I threw away the envelope with his handwriting. I told myself that what we'd had was just a strange week, a moment out of time, and that I should be grateful he left before things got complicated. It didn't work. I caught myself looking for him in the faces of every patient who came through the emergency department, even though I knew he wouldn't come back. Knew he'd left to keep me safe from whatever danger he'd been fleeing. 3 weeks passed, then 4, then 5. I went on a date with a doctor from cardiology, a perfectly nice man named Marcus, who talked about his research and complimented my eyes and kissed me goodnight at my door. I felt nothing. I started to accept that maybe I'd built Alex up in my mind into something he wasn't, that the intensity I'd felt was just the circumstances. The forbidden nature of helping a stranger, the Florence Nightingale effect in full force. And then, 6 weeks after he disappeared from my life, everything changed. I was leaving the hospital after a particularly brutal shift, a multi-car pileup that had kept me on my feet for 14 hours straight, when I noticed the car. A black Bentley, gleaming even in the gray Seattle drizzle, parked directly in front of the emergency department entrance, where parking was explicitly forbidden. I barely glanced at it as I walked past, too tired to care about entitled rich people and their expensive cars. But then I heard the sound of a car door opening behind me. Lily. That voice. I knew that voice. I turned slowly, my exhausted brain refusing to process what was happening, and found myself staring at a man who was both completely familiar and utterly transformed. Alex stood beside the Bentley in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than I made in 3 months, his hair cut and styled, his posture radiating confidence and power. But it was the eyes that made my breath stop. Those same storm gray eyes, now sharp and assessing instead of confused and lost, fixed on me with an intensity that made my knees weak. My mouth opened, but no sound came out. This couldn't be real. This had to be exhaustion-induced hallucination. He took a step toward me, and I saw the way he moved, careful and controlled, like someone who'd spent his entire life in boardrooms learning to never show weakness. "Hello, Lily," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that I couldn't identify. Relief? Nervousness? "I've been looking for you." The words from my hook, from that terrifying moment 6 weeks ago, echoed in my mind, but this time they came from a man in a $10,000 suit standing beside a car that cost more than my apartment. "Who are you?" I managed to get the words out, even though part of me already knew, had known from the moment I saw those hands that were too smooth to belong to someone who'd lived on the streets. "Alexander Hayes," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that was pure corporate reflex. "CEO of Hayes Medical Technologies. I believe you work in a hospital that uses my equipment." I stared at his extended hand like it was a snake. "You lied to me. He lowered his hand, something like pain flashing across his perfectly composed face. I didn't lie. I genuinely didn't remember. But yes, once my memory returned, I should have contacted you immediately. I'm sorry. Sorry, I repeated, and I could hear my voice rising. You disappeared for 6 weeks. I thought you might be dead. I thought someone might have found you and hurt you again. I spent weeks looking over my shoulder wondering if whoever beat you in that alley might come looking for the nurse who helped you. People were starting to stare, hospital staff and patients' families glancing over at the scene we were making, but I didn't care. And now you show up in a Bentley wearing what I'm sure is an Italian suit, telling me you're some billionaire CEO? What kind of game is this? It's not a game, Alexander said, his voice low and urgent. Lily, please, just give me 10 minutes to explain. That's all I'm asking. I should have told him to go to hell. I should have walked away and never looked back, let him return to his billionaire life while I went back to mine. But I was so tired, and he was looking at me like I was the only thing in the world that mattered, and despite everything, I wanted answers. 10 minutes, I said coldly. But not here. People are staring. My car. He gestured to the Bentley. I'm not getting in your car. Then where? There's a coffee shop 2 blocks away. We can talk there. He nodded and said something to his driver, a man in a black suit who'd been standing silently beside the car, and then followed me as I started walking. We didn't speak during the 2-block walk, but I was hyper-aware of his presence beside me, of the way people stepped out of his way on the sidewalk, responding to some invisible signal of power and authority. The coffee shop was nearly empty at 3 in the morning, just the barista and one exhausted-looking grad student in the corner. We ordered, Alexander insisting on paying despite my protest, and sat at a table in the back. Talk, I said, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup like it could anchor me. Alexander took a sip of his own coffee, and I saw his hands shake slightly. The first crack in his perfect corporate armor, everything I told you was true. He began. I genuinely didn't remember who I was. But about 4 days after I left your apartment, my memory started coming back in pieces. By the end of that week, I knew exactly who I was and what had happened. And? I prompted when he fell silent. I'm the CEO and majority shareholder of Hayes Medical Technologies, a company I built from the ground up over the past 10 years. We manufacture medical equipment and supplies, everything from force stands to surgical instruments to the monitors you use in your emergency department. I knew the name. Every nurse in Seattle knew Hayes Medical Technologies because half our equipment had their logo on it. 6 weeks ago, I discovered that my CFO and business partner, a man named Richard Thornton, who I trusted for 8 years, had been systematically embezzling from the company and selling proprietary technology to our competitors. When I confronted him, Alexander's jaw tightened. He didn't take it well. He hired people to make sure I didn't make it to the board meeting where I planned to expose him. They beat you and left you in that alley, I said quietly, the pieces clicking into place. They were supposed to kill me. They were interrupted by a patrol car a block away and ran. By the time I woke up, I had no memory of who I was or what had happened. Just fragments, pieces that didn't fit together. And when your memory came back, I went underground. I couldn't risk going back to my life, to my penthouse, to my office, because I didn't know who Richard had paid off, who I could trust. So I disappeared. I used contacts I had from before Hayes Medical, people Richard didn't know about, to investigate. It took me 4 weeks to gather enough evidence to bring to the board. 2 weeks ago, I finally had everything I needed. Richard was arrested, his assets frozen, and control of my company returned to me. That's a fascinating story, I said, my voice flat. But it doesn't explain why you're here now, 6 weeks later, showing up at my hospital like some kind of stalker. Alexander flinched at the word stalker, but he didn't look away. I'm here because I owe you my life. I'm here because I spent 6 weeks thinking about you every single day. I'm here because the person I was before that alley would have sent a check and a thank you note through his assistant. But I don't want to be that person anymore. What do you want, Alexander? He leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. I want to take you to dinner. I want to explain everything properly, not in a coffee shop at 3 in the morning when you're exhausted from a 14-hour shift. I want a chance to show you that what happened between us in your apartment wasn't just circumstance or gratitude or trauma bonding. I was shaking my head before he finished. You don't understand. You were Alex, broken and lost and real. This, I gestured at his suit, at the Rolex on his wrist that probably cost more than I made in a year. This isn't the person I knew. No, he agreed quietly. This is who I was before you found me. But Alex, the person you knew, he's still in here. You showed me that version of myself, reminded me that I used to care about more than profit margins and market share. That's what I'm trying to hold on to. By showing up in a Bentley, he had the grace to look embarrassed. Old habits. But Lily, please, just dinner. One chance to show you that I'm not who you think I am. And if I say no, then I'll respect that decision and you'll never see me again. His voice was steady, but I heard the pain underneath. But I'm hoping you'll say yes. I should have said no. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to walk away, to protect myself from whatever disaster this was going to become. But I thought about those 8 days, about conversations in the middle of the night and almost kisses, and the way he looked at me like I was extraordinary. One dinner I heard myself say, but I'm choosing the place, and it's not going to be whatever 5-star restaurant you're thinking of. Anywhere you want, he said, and the relief in his voice was palpable. And Alexander, I met his eyes. If you lie to me again, if you hide anything or disappear or treat me like some kind of charity case, I'm done. I deserve better than that. You do, he agreed softly. You deserve so much better than what I'm offering. But I'm asking anyway, because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you for 6 weeks. And I need to know if what I felt in your apartment was real. We'll see, I said, standing up. Text me the details once we figure out when we're both free. You still have my number? I never deleted it. I walked out of that coffee shop with my heart racing and my mind spinning, wondering what I'd just agreed to and whether I was about to make the best or worst decision of my life. 3 days later, I met Alexander Hayes at a small Thai restaurant in my neighborhood. The kind of place where the plastic chairs didn't match and the food was incredible and nothing on the menu cost more than $15. He showed up in jeans and a simple black sweater, driving himself in a Toyota instead of the Bentley. And the relief I felt at seeing him dressed like a normal human being told me exactly how nervous I'd been. Is this okay? He asked, gesturing at his outfit. I wasn't sure what the dress code was. It's perfect, I said, and meant it. We ordered pad thai and green curry and spring rolls, and for the first hour, we talked about everything except what had happened between us. He told me about growing up in a small town in Oregon, about his single mother who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat, about being accepted to MIT on a full scholarship, and discovering he had a gift for understanding complex systems. He told me about his first startup, a medical supply company he'd built in his garage at 23, and how selling it had given him the capital to start Hayes Medical Technologies. He told me about his mother's death 5 years ago, a heart attack that had taken her while he was in a board meeting, and how he'd thrown himself into work afterward because it was easier than dealing with the grief. I told him about growing up in a working-class neighborhood in Brooklyn, about my own single mother who'd encouraged my dreams even when we could barely afford groceries, about nursing school and student loans, and choosing Seattle because it was as far from New York as I could get. I told him about my first code, a 17-year-old overdose patient we'd lost despite our best efforts, and how I'd cried in the supply closet for an hour afterward. I told him about the patients who kept me going, the lives we saved, the moments of connection in the middle of crisis that reminded me why I'd chosen this brutal, beautiful profession. By the time we finished eating, 3 hours had passed and the restaurant was closing, and I realized with a start that I'd been so absorbed in talking to him that I'd forgotten to be nervous. "Walk you home?" Alexander offered, and I nodded. We walked slowly through the Seattle streets, the night air cool and damp, neither of us in a hurry to end the evening. "I need to ask you something," I said as we turned onto my street. "And I need you to be honest. Anything. When you were in my apartment, when you were Alex, was any of that real? Or were you just playing a role until you could get back to your real life?" Alexander stopped walking, turning to face me under a streetlight. Everything was real. The conversations, the connection, the way I felt when you looked at me like I was worth saving even when I had nothing to offer. That was the most real I'd felt in years. "But you left," I reminded him. "Because I remembered that people had tried to kill me, and staying meant putting you in danger. Because I cared about you enough to leave even though it was the last thing I wanted to do. And now? What do you want now?" He stepped closer, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. "I want to know if that feeling was real for you too. I want to know if there's a possibility that this could be something more than just a strange week where our lives intersected." My heart was hammering against my ribs. "What if we're too different? What if your world and my world don't fit together?" "Then we'll figure it out," he said quietly. "Or we'll try and fail and at least know we gave it a chance." "But Lily, I haven't felt this alive, this present, this real since I walked out of your apartment. And I don't think that's something I should just let go." I looked up at him, at those storm gray eyes that had first captured me in a rainy alley 6 weeks ago, and made a choice. I kissed him. It was soft and tentative at first, testing, but when his hands came up to cup my face and he kissed me back with an intensity that took my breath away, tentative disappeared. This was the kiss we'd almost had in my apartment. All the promise and heat and desperate connection we'd both been holding back, finally released. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against mine. "Come back to my place," he said quietly. "Not for anything except more of this, more talking, more time. I'm not ready for tonight to end." I should have said no. I should have taken things slow, protected myself, been reasonable. But reasonable had never gotten me anywhere worth going. "Okay," I whispered. His penthouse was in downtown Seattle, the kind of building where the doorman wore white gloves and the elevator required a key. Card and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows showed the entire city spread out like a glittering carpet. I stood at those windows while Alexander poured us wine, trying to process the difference between his world and mine. "It's too much, isn't it?" he said quietly from behind me, and I heard the vulnerability in his voice. I turned to face him. "It's a lot. But I'm not running." "You should probably run," he said with a slight smile. "I'm a workaholic with control issues and a tendency to solve every problem by throwing money at it. I'm terrible at relationships. I haven't had one last longer than 3 months in 5 years. I'm probably going to screw this up spectacularly." "Probably," I agreed, taking the wine glass he offered. "I have trust issues from a previous relationship that ended badly. I work 80-hour weeks and come home smelling like hospital. I'm stubborn and I don't back down from arguments. I'm also probably going to screw this up. So we're both disasters waiting to happen. Basically." He laughed, and the sound was so warm and genuine that it made my chest ache. "Want to be disasters together?" "Yeah," I said softly. "I really do." We spent that night talking until dawn broke over Seattle, learning each other in ways that had nothing to do with physical intimacy and everything to do with the slow revelation of fears and dreams. He told me about the loneliness of being at the top, how every interaction felt transactional, how he hadn't had a real friend in years because everyone wanted something from him. I told him about the exhaustion of caring for people who were dying, how sometimes I went home and cried for hours over patients I couldn't save, how nursing was both the best and worst thing I'd ever done to myself. When the sun came up, we were lying on his couch, my head on his chest, his fingers running through my hair in a gesture that felt both intimate and innocent. "I have to go home," I said reluctantly. "I have a shift in 6 hours and I need to shower and change. Can I see you again soon?" "Tomorrow? I have the night off." "Tomorrow," he agreed. Over the next 3 weeks, we fell into a pattern that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. Alexander would pick me up after my shifts, and we'd go to museums after hours because he knew people who would open them just for us, or to tiny hole-in-the-wall restaurants that served incredible food, or sometimes just back to his penthouse where we'd order takeout and talk until one of us fell asleep. He was attentive and thoughtful in ways I'd never experienced. He remembered everything I said, noticed when I was tired or stressed, sent lunch to the hospital on days when he knew I wouldn't have time to eat. But I also started to see the cracks in the fantasy. Alexander Hayes, Billionaire CEO, was different from Alex, the man I'd found in an alley. He was colder sometimes, more calculating, slipping into a mode where everything was about efficiency and control. I saw it when we were at a charity dinner and a colleague approached him with a funding request. The warmth disappeared from his eyes, replaced by sharp assessment, and his response was polite but dismissive in a way that made the other man visibly deflate. I saw it when his phone rang during dinner and he answered immediately, even though we'd agreed on no interruptions, spending 20 minutes discussing a contract negotiation while I sat across from him feeling invisible. I saw it when he introduced me to his friends, other CEOs and venture capitalists, and I could feel their judgment, their assessment of whether I was good enough to be with him, their confusion about why a billionaire was dating an nurse. One particularly terrible evening, we attended a gala at the Seattle Art Museum. The kind of event where tickets cost $10,000 and everyone was wearing clothes that cost more than my car. Alexander had insisted on buying me a dress, a beautiful blue gown that probably cost more than my monthly rent. And while I'd initially resisted, he pointed out that I couldn't wear scrubs to a formal gala. I felt like a fraud the entire night, smiling and making small talk with people who lived in a different universe than mine. Watching Alexander slip seamlessly into his role as powerful CEO, charming and confident and utterly at home. And then his ex-girlfriend arrived. Natasha Volkov, a stunning Russian model turned entrepreneur, walked into the gala wearing a dress that probably cost more than my yearly salary, and I watched every head in the room turn to follow her. She made a beeline for Alexander, kissing him on both cheeks in that European way that suggested intimacy, and I saw the flash of something in his eyes that I couldn't quite identify. "Darling," she said, ignoring me completely. "I heard about your troubles with Richard. How terribly stressful that must have been." "It's handled," Alexander said smoothly. "Natasha, this is Lily Carter, Lily Natasha Volkov." Natasha finally deigned to look at me, her eyes sweeping over me in a single assessing glance that made me feel like I'd been weighed and found wanting. "How nice," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And what is it you do, Lily?" "I'm a nurse at Seattle General." "How noble," Natasha said, and the word sounded like an insult. Alexander has always had a soft spot for charity cases. The words hit like a physical blow, and I saw Alexander's jaw tighten in anger. But before he could respond, Natasha had already turned away, floating off to charm some other billionaire. I lasted another hour at that gala, smiling and pretending that nothing was wrong. But inside I was falling apart. When we finally left, Alexander immediately tried to apologize. "Don't listen to Natasha. She's bitter and cruel and she doesn't know anything about us. Doesn't she though? I said quietly as we stood on the sidewalk waiting for his car. Am I just another charity case to you, Alexander? Another person you're rescuing because it makes you feel good about yourself. That's not fair, isn't it? You bought this dress. You pay for every dinner. You send lunch to the hospital. I can't even afford the wine you order at restaurants. How is this ever going to work when we live in completely different worlds? I don't care about any of that. But I do, I said, feeling tears burning behind my eyes. I care that when I'm with you and your friends, I feel like I'm playing dress up. I care that you become someone different in that world, someone colder and harder, and I don't know which version is real. They're both real, he said quietly. The person I am with you, that's who I want to be. The person I am in business, that's who I have to be to survive in that world. But I can't compete with that world, Alexander. I can't be what those people expect you to have. I don't want you to be anything other than exactly who you are. Then why do I feel like I'm losing you every time we're around them? We stood there on the sidewalk, the Seattle rain starting to fall, and I saw the moment when something in him shut down. When the walls went up and CEO Alexander replaced the man I'd fallen for. Maybe you're right, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Maybe this isn't going to work. Maybe we're too different. The words were like ice water. Is that what you really think? I think I don't know how to do this. I think everything I touch eventually falls apart because I'm better at building companies than relationships. I think you deserve someone who can give you what you need without making you feel like you're not enough. I'm not the one who's not enough, I said, my voice breaking. I'm exactly who I've always been. You're the one who keeps changing depending on who's watching. That's not fair, he said again. Life's not fair, Alexander. I learned that a long time ago. And I'm learning now that rescuing someone doesn't mean you're supposed to be with them. I turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the rain outside the museum. And I didn't look back even though every cell in my body was screaming at me to turn around. I caught a bus home, crying silently in the back seat, the beautiful blue dress already soaked from the rain. 3 days passed without contact. I threw myself into work, picking up extra shifts, barely sleeping, trying to pretend that my heart wasn't breaking into smaller pieces every hour. On the 4th day, I was in the middle of treating a car accident victim when I heard a commotion in the emergency department waiting room. A moment later, one of the other nurses poked her head into my trauma bay. Lily, there's someone here demanding to see you. Security is about to remove him, but he says it's an emergency. My heart stopped. Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes. I finished stabilizing my patient, turned him over to the attending physician, and walked out to the waiting room with my heart in my throat. Alexander was standing near the reception desk, looking like hell. His suit was rumpled. His hair was a mess, and he had dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept any better than I had. When he saw me, relief flooded his face. Lily, thank God. I need to talk to you. Not here, I said quietly, gesturing toward the exit. Outside. We walked out to the ambulance bay, the one place where we could talk without an audience. What are you doing here, Alexander? I've been an idiot, he said without preamble. You were right about everything. I've been trying to keep you separate from my business life because I was scared that if I brought you fully into that world, you'd see how empty it all is. How empty I've been. Alexander, I started, but he held up a hand. Please let me finish. I had a board meeting yesterday. A routine thing, nothing special. But I sat there listening to people drone on about market share and quarterly projections, and all I could think was that none of it mattered. That I'd built this empire thinking it would make me happy. But the only time I felt truly happy in years was when I was with you. He took a step closer. I don't know how to balance my world and yours. I don't know how to be both the CEO and the man you met in your apartment. But I'm willing to figure it out if you are. Because losing you feels like dying. I've been miserable too, I admitted. But Alexander, I can't keep feeling like I'm not enough. Like I'm some kind of project or charity case. You're not. You're the person who saved my life without knowing if I was worth saving. You're the person who saw me as human when I had nothing to offer. You're the only person in my life who wants me for me and not for what I can give them. How do I know that? How do I know you won't wake up one day and realize you'd be better off with someone like Natasha, someone who fits into your world? Because I already tried that world, he said quietly. I spent years with people like Natasha, people who understand corporate politics and charity galas and all the games we play. And I was lonelier than I've ever been. The week I spent in your apartment, not knowing who I was the first time in a decade that I felt like I could breathe. But you can't live in my apartment forever, I said, trying for humor even as tears were streaming down my face. You have a company to run. No, he agreed, but I can step back. I can promote my VP of operations to CEO and move into a chairman role. I can cut my work hours in half. I can remember that building a company was supposed to be a means to an end, not the end itself. You do that? I'd do anything to keep you in my life. And Lily, I want to bring you into mine. Not because I want to change you, but because I want you to see all of me, including the parts that aren't pretty. I want you to come to board meetings and tell me when I'm being a cold corporate asshole. I want you to meet my employees and let them see what real compassion looks like. I want to do this right. I stood there in the ambulance bay, rain starting to fall again because this was Seattle and rain was apparently a constant in my relationship with Alexander Hayes, and I had a choice to make. I could protect myself. I could walk away and go back to my safe, predictable life where no one had the power to hurt me like this. Or I could take a risk on something terrifying and potentially wonderful. Okay, I said quietly. Okay. But I have conditions. If we do this, we do it as equals. I don't want you paying for everything. I don't want expensive gifts. I want a partner, not a benefactor. Done. And I need you to be honest with me about your world. Don't hide the ugly parts. Let me see what I'm signing up for. I can do that. And Alexander, if you ever make me feel like a charity case again, I'm out. No second chances. I deserve better than that. You do, he agreed, stepping close enough to cup my face in his hands. You deserve everything. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. He kissed me then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, we could make this work. 6 months later, I stood in front of the mirror in Alexander's bathroom, trying to zip up a dress that cost more than 3 months of my rent. My hands were shaking. Tonight was the annual Hayes Medical Technologies Charity Gala, the biggest event of the year, and Alexander had asked me to be his official date, not hidden away at a side table, but right beside him as he gave his speech to the board and shareholders. This was it. This was me stepping fully into his world. No more hiding, no more keeping our relationship separate from his professional life. I was terrified. The door opened and Alexander walked in, looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo. And when he saw me, he stopped short. You look incredible, he said quietly. I look like I'm playing dress up, I muttered, still struggling with the zipper. He crossed to me, gently moving my hands aside and slowly zipping the dress, his fingers leaving trails of heat along my spine. You look like the woman who saved my life, he said, meeting my eyes in the mirror. Beautiful and strong and completely out of my league. I'm freaking out, I admitted. I know, but Lily, everyone at that gala tonight knows who you are and what you mean to me. I've made sure of it. You're not walking in there as some mystery woman. You're walking in there as my partner. What if they hate me? Then they're idiots. He turned me around to face him, And honestly, I've spent the last 6 months realizing that I don't actually care what most of those people think. The ones who matter, the ones who've become real friends, already love you because they've seen how you've changed me. How have I changed you? I smile more. I leave the office at reasonable hours. I've actually taken a vacation. I spent 3 hours last week teaching kids about science at an elementary school in your neighborhood instead of attending a networking lunch. I'm becoming someone I actually like again. I reached up to straighten his bow tie even though it didn't need straightening. What if I mess up? Use the wrong fork or say the wrong thing? Then you'll be human. Which will be refreshing considering the robots we usually invite to these things. Despite my nerves, I laughed. You're terrible. I'm in love with you, he corrected. Those are different things. It was the first time he'd said it. We'd been dancing around the words for weeks, both of us too scared to be the first to break the silence. I love you too, I whispered. He kissed me softly. Ready to go show Seattle society what they're in for? As I'll ever be. The gala was being held at the Four Seasons, and when we arrived in Alexander's car, not the Bentley but a Tesla that was still ridiculously expensive but felt somehow more reasonable, photographers were already lining the entrance. I hesitated before getting out of the car, but Alexander squeezed my hand. Together, he said. We walked in together, his hand on my lower back, and I felt the weight of hundreds of eyes turning to look at us. But then I saw familiar faces, Dr. Richardson from the hospital, who waved enthusiastically. Sarah, one of the other nurses, who'd been invited because Alexander had quietly donated money to sponsor hospital staff attendance. Marcus from cardiology, who gave me a thumbs up. This wasn't enemy territory. This was just a party with some nice people and some terrible people, same as anywhere else. I relaxed slightly. The evening was actually wonderful. Alexander introduced me to everyone as his girlfriend, no hedging or awkwardness. And while I definitely got some judgmental looks from people like Natasha, who was there with some hedge fund manager, most people were genuinely kind. And when Alexander gave his speech, talking about how Hayes Medical Technologies was doubling its charitable contributions to hospitals serving low-income communities, he looked directly at me and said, I was reminded recently by someone very important to me that the purpose of building wealth is to do good with it, not just accumulate more. The applause was thunderous, and when he came back to our table, he pulled me onto the dance floor. This is the part where I tell you that I'm terrible at dancing, I warned him. This is the part where I tell you I don't care, he countered, pulling me close. We swayed together in the middle of the ballroom, surrounded by Seattle's elite, and for the first time since he'd shown up at the hospital in his Bentley, I felt like I truly belonged in his world. Not because I'd changed to fit it, but because he'd changed his world to make room for me. Later that night, back at his penthouse, I finally asked the question that had been nagging at me for months. Do you ever regret it, ending up in that alley? Having to go through all of that? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder as we lay together on his couch, the Seattle skyline glittering through the windows. I regret that Richard betrayed me. I regret that people I trusted tried to kill me. I regret the pain that whole situation caused for a lot of people. But then he tilted my face up to meet his eyes. But do I regret ending up in that alley where you found me? Do I regret losing everything so I could learn what actually matters? Never. Because that night led me to you. And you, Lily Carter, are the best thing that's ever happened to me. Even better than building a billion-dollar company. Not even close, he said with a smile. The company is just money and power. You're home. We got married 6 months later in a small ceremony at City Hall, just us and a handful of close friends. Nothing fancy or elaborate. I wore a simple white dress from a boutique in my neighborhood. Alexander wore a suit that wasn't even his most expensive one. We exchanged rings that he let me pay for half of, honoring my need for equality. And when the officiant pronounced us married and Alexander kissed me, I felt like the luckiest person in the world. We didn't go on some elaborate honeymoon to the Maldives or Paris or wherever rich people went to celebrate their marriages. Instead, we spent 2 weeks at a cabin in the mountains, hiking and cooking meals together and learning to just be with each other without the weight of his business or my hospital shifts or any of the complications of our regular lives. It was perfect. When we got back to Seattle, we had to figure out the practical realities of our life together. I kept working at Seattle General, though I cut back to part-time at Alexander's gentle insistence, not because he wanted me to stop working, but because he hated seeing me exhausted and burned out from 80-hour weeks. I kept my apartment for the first few months, some stubborn part of me not ready to give up my independence. But eventually I admitted that spending every night at Alexander's penthouse meant I was paying rent on a place I never used. So I moved in, and Alexander cleaned out half his closet and bathroom and made space for my things. And slowly the sterile penthouse became our home. I learned to navigate his world. I attended board meetings when he asked me to and discovered I had opinions about healthcare supply chain logistics that people actually listened to. I went to charity events and fundraisers and learned to make small talk with billionaires, but I also dragged him into my world. He came to hospital fundraisers where he was the richest person in the room by several orders of magnitude but managed to not be awkward about it. He met my nurse friends and discovered he actually enjoyed talking to people who had no interest in using him for business connections. We figured out how to be partners in a way that honored both of our lives. And then, about a year after we got married, I discovered I was pregnant. I took the test in the bathroom at work during a break, staring at the 2 pink lines in complete shock, even though we hadn't been particularly careful about preventing pregnancy. I was terrified to tell Alexander. We'd never discussed kids. We'd been so focused on figuring out how to make our relationship work that we'd never talked about whether we wanted children or when or how that would work with my career and his responsibilities. But that night, I came home to find him in the kitchen, attempting to make dinner, which usually ended in disaster but was endearing anyway. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice shaking. He immediately set down the knife he'd been using to murder vegetables and gave me his full attention. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. At least I don't think it's wrong. But it's definitely something. Lily, you're scaring me. I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between us for what felt like an eternity, and I watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to identify. Then he smiled. A smile so bright and genuine that it took my breath away. "We're having a baby?" "We're having a baby," I confirmed. He crossed to me in 3 long strides and pulled me into his arms, holding me tight enough that I could feel his heart racing. "This is the best news I've heard in my entire life." "Really?" "Because we never talked about this and I know your company is in the middle of a huge expansion and I'm terrified that I'm going to be a terrible mother." "You're going to be an incredible mother," he said firmly, pulling back to look at me. "And yes, the company is always doing something, but companies can wait. This, us, our baby, that's what actually matters." I started crying then, relief and happiness and hormones all overwhelming me at once, and Alexander just held me and let me fall apart. The pregnancy was actually pretty easy. I worked up until my 7th month, when climbing up and down the stairs of my building started to feel genuinely dangerous with my shifted center of gravity. Alexander wanted me to stop working earlier, but I compromised by moving to a consulting role where I helped develop better protocols for patient care without having to be on my feet for 12-hour shifts. We turned one of the spare bedrooms in the penthouse into a nursery, and I discovered that Alexander had very strong opinions about whether the walls should be painted blue or green or just left white. We ended up compromising on a soft gray that made the room feel calm and peaceful. 7 months into the pregnancy, during a routine ultrasound, we discovered we were having a girl. Alexander cried. Actually cried, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the screen showing our daughter moving and stretching inside me. A girl, he kept saying. We're having a daughter. Are you disappointed? I asked because I'd heard stories of men who wanted sons. He looked at me like I was crazy. Disappointed? Lily, I'm terrified. I have no idea how to raise a strong, confident, amazing woman, but I have you to teach me. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure our daughter knows she can do anything. Our daughter was born on a rainy February morning after 16 hours of labor that Alexander sat through every second of, holding my hand and breathing with me and being exactly what I needed. When the doctor finally placed her in my arms, tiny and red and screaming her fury at the cold world, I looked down at her perfect face and fell in love for the second time in my life. Alexander was beside me, one hand gently touching her head, his face full of wonder. What should we name her? I asked. We'd discussed names for months without agreeing on anything, but now, looking at her, I knew exactly what felt right. Grace, I said. Grace Hayes. For the second chance we gave each other. It's perfect, Alexander whispered. She's perfect. You're perfect. How did I get this lucky? You almost died in an alley, I reminded him with a tired smile. Best thing that ever happened to me, he said, and kissed me softly. Raising Grace turned out to be both harder and more wonderful than anything I'd ever done. The first few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless diapers, and trying to figure out how to keep a tiny human alive when she seemed determined to cry no. Matter what we did, Alexander was surprisingly good at it. He took paternity leave from the company, something the board was shocked by but grudgingly accepted, and spent those first 3 months as involved as I was in every aspect of Grace's care. I watched him become a father in real time, learning to change diapers and warm bottles and walk circles around the penthouse at 3 a.m, singing off-key lullabies. He was exhausted and stressed and covered in spit up half the time, and I'd never loved him more. When Grace was 6 months old, I made the decision to go back to nursing part-time, working 3 12-hour shifts a week at the hospital. Alexander supported it even though he would have been happy for me to stay home full-time, if that's what I wanted. But I needed to be more than just Grace's mother. I needed to still be Lily Carter, the nurse who saved lives, the woman who'd fought so hard to build her career. We hired a nanny, an older woman named Rosa who Grace adored and who treated me like family rather than just an employer. And slowly, we figured out how to balance everything, parenting and careers and our relationship, all the pieces of our complicated, messy, beautiful life. On Grace's first birthday, we threw a party at our penthouse, inviting both our worlds, hospital staff and business associates and friends and family all mixing together in a way that would have seemed impossible 2 years ago. I stood by the windows holding Grace, who was wearing a tiny pink dress and had frosting from her birthday cake smeared all over her face, and watched Alexander across the room laughing with Dr. Richardson about something. He caught my eye and smiled, that smile that was reserved just for me, and mouthed, I love you. I love you too, I mouthed back. This is what I was running from, I thought, adjusting Grace on my hip as she grabbed for my necklace, this perfect, terrifying, beautiful thing. And I almost missed it because I was too scared to take the risk. Sarah, my friend from the IA, appeared beside me with a glass of wine. You look happy. I am, I said, meaning it completely. Terrified and exhausted and covered in baby food half the time, but happy. You guys are goals, Sarah said, gesturing to where Alexander was now being cornered by Marcus from cardiology, probably about some medical research funding. Like, actual fairy tale ending goals. It wasn't always like this, I reminded her. We almost didn't make it. There were moments when I thought we were too different, that it would never work. But you figured it out. We worked at it, I corrected. Every single day, we choose each other. That's the secret. It's not magic or fate or any of that. It's work and communication and being willing to change. Still, Sarah said with a grin, homeless man turns out to be billionaire CEO who falls madly in love with the nurse who saved him? That's pretty fairy tale. I laughed. When you put it like that, I guess it is. Grace started fussing, ready for her nap, and I excused myself to take her to the nursery. Alexander followed me, appearing in the doorway as I was rocking her to sleep. Need help? He whispered. I've got her, I whispered back. But you can stay if you want. He came into the room and sat in the chair beside the rocker, watching as Grace's eyes slowly closed, her tiny fist clutching my finger. I never thought I'd have this, he said quietly. A family. Someone who loves me for me and not what I can provide. A daughter who will grow up knowing she's loved unconditionally. All of this. You almost didn't, I reminded him. If Richard hadn't betrayed you, if those men hadn't beaten you, if I hadn't happened to walk down that alley that specific night. But all of that did happen, he said. And I choose to believe it happened for a reason. Because maybe I needed to lose everything to learn what actually mattered. Maybe we both did, I said softly. When Grace was fully asleep, I carefully transferred her to her crib and we tiptoed out of the nursery, leaving the door cracked. We stood in the hallway, and Alexander pulled me close, wrapping his arms around me in a way that had become as natural as breathing. Thank you, he whispered into my hair. For what? For saving me. Not just that night in the alley, but every day since. For seeing past the money and the power to the person underneath. For giving me a chance even when I didn't deserve it. For this life we've built together. You saved me too, I said. You reminded me that I'm worth more than just how many lives I can save at work. You showed me that it's okay to want things for myself. You gave me permission to be happy. We're quite the pair, he said with a smile. We really are. We went back to our party, hand in hand, and I looked around at all the people who'd become part of our story, at the life we built from the ashes of that terrifying night in a Seattle alley. Sometimes I think about how easily it could have gone differently, if I'd walked past him like everyone else did. If he'd died before I found him. If I'd been too scared to take him home. If he'd never shown up at the hospital that day 6 weeks later. So many moments where everything could have fallen apart. But we'd both made choices, over and over again, to fight for this. To fight for us. And standing there in our home, surrounded by people we loved, holding the hand of the man who'd changed my life in ways I was still discovering, I knew that every risk had been worth it. The end. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it reached your heart, even just a little, do not leave without letting me know. A simple heart in the comments is enough. And if you want to feel more stories like this, stories about love that survives impossible odds, about second chances that change everything, about finding home in the most unexpected places, make sure to subscribe to Dramora Stories. Every story here is a reminder that courage sometimes looks like kneeling beside a stranger in a rainy alley. That love can be born from the most unlikely circumstances, and that the best things in life often come from the moments when we choose compassion over fear. And maybe that is true for you too.